All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give it a couple seconds here as people jump on. I know it's a snowy day here in New York and probably in many parts of the country. So I am Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. So we'll get started now. And we're really excited today to have a conversation around uniting the techno democracies and forging digital cooperation. And we can make that a lot less abstract today because we have one of the originators of the idea here to speak with us today. Just as background for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are Network 2020 is a nonprofit organization. We're really focused on building an inclusive worldwide community that bridges the gap between the private sector and foreign policy worlds. And so, what that means for us is, we run a number of programs, but we're really trying to, on the one hand, provide more avenues for education around foreign policy for those who aren't immediately steeped in it every day. And at the same time, we're also trying to bring some of the ideas and expertise and ways of thinking to foreign policy challenges from this global network who might have other experiences. And so we do run a lot of programs in addition to the virtual briefing series, and we encourage you to check them out on our website and also follow us on social media. One announcement, we are very excited about our virtual benefit, which will take place on March 24th at 7 p.m. We will be honoring a few people, including Jean-Yves Fillon, the CEO of BNP Paribas USA, as well as Clarissa Ward, who is the chief international correspondent for CNN. And we will be recognizing 3 up-and-coming organizations worldwide that are taking innovative approaches to tackling challenges that affect foreign policy. And those winners will be announced after we close applications this Friday. So if you know of any organizations, there's still time to nominate. So next up, we are introducing today our speaker, who is Richard Fontaine. He is the CEO of the Center for New American Security, and he has been there for quite some time. He has been very steeped in the policy world, so comes with a lot of background, as you can see from the slide. He was a senior foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, and he's worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so he's really been able to see foreign policy from all angles in the government. I'm not going to dig too deep into the rest of the bio because you can see a lot of it on there, but one of the really important points to note today is that he, and I think Joanna will touch on this later, but he is the author of an article in Foreign Affairs that was very much about this subject of uniting techno democracies, which is a really important and forward-thinking idea. Our moderator today is Network 2020 member Joanna Waszczowski. She is a nonprofit management consultant and has a lot of experience in both domestic and international affairs. She's been a key member of Network 2020 and has participated in overseas trips to Poland and helped us author our report. And she has served as a foreign policy advisor to congressional candidates in Connecticut as well. And again, I apologize, I'm going to cut the bio a little short so we have more time for the conversation, but she has a lot of terrific experience and we're very glad that she will be running the discussion today. And so I think with that, we're about to kick it off. The one last announcement that I'm going to make is that usually we've been doing post-event discussion groups. We're not going to do that today because we have another conflict. So I apologize, but we'll get back to that in the future. So with that, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Joanna. And Joanna, over to you.
Thank you, Courtney, and welcome, Richard. The New York Times columnist Tom Friedman recently wrote that cyberspace is a realm where we're all connected, but no one is in charge. In an article in the recent edition of Foreign Affairs, you outlined why the US and its allies should build cooperation. You described how in the beginning of the digital age, democracies appeared ascendant and that the internet had the potential to undermine authoritarian governments. But now it appears that the autocratic states have caught up and that the internet has become an essential tool in oppressing their citizens and spreading disinformation, especially during the time of COVID-19. Some of those countries, such as China, are promoting their technological abilities globally at the expense of the United States. So the question is, How should the United States and its allies respond to this current state of affairs? So let me ask you, Richard, if you could please elaborate on what you mean by techno democracy and why it is so important for them to work together as an alliance when it comes to technological issues.
All right, well, thank you for having me. Thanks to you, Joanna, for moderating this, and Courtney for inviting me to do this, and for what you're doing with Network 2020, which I think is a really critical role to be able to connect the private sectors and the policy worlds and talk about some of the issues like the ones we're talking about today that have no answers wholly in one sphere or the other, but in fact really link private sector actors and thinkers and public sector actors and thinkers, and we won't really get anywhere without both sides. So thanks for what you guys are doing. You know, I suppose that Tom Friedman is right that the cyberspace is a realm in which we're all connected, but nobody's in charge. But of course, the world is also a realm in which we're all connected and nobody's in charge. So, you know, in that sense, that's not how I think of the sort of defining characteristic necessarily of what we're talking about. I think that there's been a shift in mindset over time with respect to democracy and the free flow of information online and autocracies and all this. So, you know, there was a lot of kind of cyber utopianism, I don't know, a decade or so ago, and certainly in the run up to the Arab Spring and things like that. And with respect to China, where we thought, okay, you know, this is really going to undermine the autocracies of the world. You know, they've had a monopoly on information inside their countries. They propagandized their citizens. They've kept a close eye on them. Suddenly, people can communicate beyond the watchful eye of Big Brother. They can access information from anywhere in the world beyond censorship or propaganda and so forth. And a lot of that is true to an extent, but of course, autocracies came roaring back and actually used their centralized power to centralize information and the control of information in a way that has really turned the balance of power in a lot of ways in their favor. And so I think a lot of that kind of cyber utopianism has gone by the wayside. And what has happened in the intervening years has not only been the fact that I think we've gotten more realistic about how the diffusion of information and the flow of information online can either go toward democracy and freedom and free flow, or toward autocracy and centralization and repression. But the United States has the gap between the United States and a lot of its friends and allies and autocracies, especially China, on sheer technology innovation has really shrunk. And so right now we have a situation where the United States, on a lot of the issues that link foreign policy, domestic policy, and technology, has been pretty reactive. So, you know, China's made rapid progress on 5G, as everybody follows the Huawei debate knows. And the United States and its friends have had a real hard time figuring out what to do about that. On AI and quantum computing, it's been a little bit of a similar story. China's launched its Digital Silk Road, this array of technological infrastructure projects to go along with its Belt and Road Initiative. It's talking about developing a digital currency for the renminbi. You know, U.S. officials are complaining about Beijing dominance in these arcane setting of technical standards in different international organizations and things like that. And China's economic power on top of that. And there are values embedded in all of these things. And so it creates an overarching kind of competition between the democracies, what we call the techno democracies on one side and the techno autocracies on the other. And then of course the big question is, okay, great, what's your idea, smarty pants? What are you going to do about all that? And what one of the things that we propose in this article that was referenced earlier is the formation of a group of techno democracies, a sort of T12, to be able to harmonize their efforts in a much more concerted fashion.
Okay, and what countries would make up the T12, and also what would it be modeled after, kind of the alliance or cooperation that you're envisioning? Are you envisioning something more like a NATO or more like a G20?
More like a G7. And if you look at the way the G7 originated, it started with five of the five most advanced economies, which were also democracies. Then it grew into G7, grew into G8 with Russia, now G7. And if you look at it, it's actually not seven because the European Union's in there. And how do you do that? But what it's been, and a lot of times these things are dismissed by skeptics as sort of talk shops. Everybody gets together, takes a big picture together, sits around a round table or whatever, issues a joint statement. That's it. And that's not actually the case. I mean, personally, having worked on G8 issues, the National Security Council years ago and things like that, these can be really, really compelling coordination mechanisms. So just to give an example before I get to the sort of T12 stuff, after 9/11, the reason why we had internationally agreed standards on hardened cockpit doors was because the G8 adopted that standard and it sort of went around. PEPFAR, which has saved the lives of millions of Africans who were infected with HIV, was a G7, G8 initiative. After the global financial crisis, the G20 coordinated fiscal and monetary policy, including across all the big economies. And so these things, when used right, can work. What we've identified is there's a gap when it comes to the technology issues. So the G7 leaves out important countries. The G20 includes countries we wouldn't want included, like China and Russia. NATO is a military alliance that's is transatlantic. So there's not really an existing. OECD is too broad and inclusive. So we think there needs to be something new. And the thing that we think needs to be something new, we call it the T12, and you could design such a thing different ways, but something like an international grouping. We propose US, France, Germany, UK, that all have large economies and really impressive technology sectors, and then also Australia, Canada, South Korea, smaller economies but important tech players, and then Finland and Sweden, who have really key tech, telecommunications and engineering capabilities, and then Israel, tech kind of superpower, and India, superpower in all measures. So that would be kind of the 12, and then you could imagine this, expanding to other states if that was successful down the line.
Do you think there's evidence of some interest in forming such a cooperation?
Yeah, there is interest. In the Washington Post last week, there was some reporting by David Ignatius about what he referred to as Biden's ambitious techno authoritarian agenda. I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact words. But there was a couple of unnamed senior administration officials who expressed keen enthusiasm for marching out on this and doing something about it, probably this year. So it looks like this won't just be one of those ideas that sort of everybody says, oh, that's nice, that's interesting, okay, what do you got next? But rather something that can actually take life. Now, exactly what it looks like when it takes life, who knows? We'll have to see. But I find that pretty encouraging that the new team is looking at this pretty hard.
Yeah, that is exciting. What are some likely areas of common interest that the T12 would want to promote or cooperate on?
Yeah, and there's a certain kind of agenda that I think ranges from the less ambitious to the more ambitious to the really damn ambitious. And so, with anything like something like this, you would want to start with the less ambitious and start some success and everything, so that that at the easiest level you could do information sharing, updating the members on what each knows about the security of supply chains, particularly in areas like semiconductors, where China really wants to reduce the portion of the market that's controlled by the South Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Americans, along with the Dutch and Japanese as well. audits of supply chains across national frontiers, especially those that they have Chinese-made components or software, comparing assessments of 5G risks. I mean, if anybody's followed sort of the diplomatic comings and goings on the Huawei, should it build out 5G? It's been all over the place for a few years now, and trying to harmonize at least the diagnosis and risk assessments associated with those, theft of intellectual property, stuff like that. A slightly higher level of ambition would be setting standards. There's probably no more boring words in foreign policy other than maybe technical assistance than, international standard setting. But it turns out this stuff is actually really important. These bodies, which a lot of folks have never heard of, that set international standards for emerging technologies. China has got a whole plan for how to actually, work this to its advantage, and to be able to combine our forces in there and actually, look at, something like facial recognition software, for example, and what we believe the standards around its use should be, and things like that. You then sort of going higher in terms of ambition. There are differences among the members of such a group, right? I mean, the United States and has a commitment to free speech that's more absolute than our friends in Europe. Friends in Europe have a commitment to privacy that's more absolute than, and so, having this as a venue in order to try to at least narrow some of those gaps or provide some sort of understanding. You could imagine coordinating investments on, our R&D, securing supply chains, semiconductor fabrication, things like that. And then at kind of the highest level would be actually coordinating policies. And I say highest level because so many of these policies are rooted in the treatment of domestic economics, not just foreign policy, but coordinating policies and trying to build some norms, which everyone starts to think, well, let's go build some norms. That's easy. That's actually hard as hell. So, that would be sort of a bottom to top, start with the things that are more easily available and go toward the harder stuff if you can make some progress.
And yeah, so you have these different levels of potential cooperation. And my question is, after the last 4 years, the United States status has been a little dented in the world and with its allies. Do you foresee that as being a problem? I'm thinking recently that President Macron stated that Europe should be an autonomous partner, that it wants to avoid dependence on China or even US as an ally. So do you see that as any concern, or do you think now with Biden being president that should work out for our interests?
No, I mean, we're going to have to deal with those doubts. So there are doubts really at two levels. One is the lurching that we've seen in foreign policy over the past few years. So, whatever bright idea the Biden administration has, should a foreign country sign up to it if it involves risk, knowing that the next president may say, we're making this all go away. And so that's just something we're going to have to work through. And we're asking countries to, join in something like this or really anything else. They've got to think ultimately, well, was Trump the aberration, or is Biden the aberration, or are we going to go sort of a Trump type presidency to a Biden type presidency to a Trump type presidency, and there's not going to be enough consistency for us to be able to absorb any level of risk, knowing that we'll have big America on our side indefinitely. And there's no great answer to that question unless you know who the next president is going to be. We can't reassure, and if you do, please let me know. I have a vested interest. But we can't reassure people absolutely. What we can do is point to the areas of continuity. And on something like this, I should note that we published this thing last August before we knew the next president was, and had consultations with pretty senior people in the Trump administration who were also really interested in the idea. So I think this particular idea is not as subject to the lurching that we see in other areas. The other problem we have is, this is an assembly of democracies, right? And at a minimum, the autocracies of the world are gleeful in pointing out how hypocritical it looks for the United States, preaching the virtues of democracy and freedom when our capital is under attack and our president wouldn't accept a peaceful transfer of power and all these other kinds of things. That may be true, but the issues are still there. And so the question remains, do you want to do something about it or do you not? And ultimately, I think in the United States, we have to demonstrate that we have fidelity to our principles, even though we can be pretty damn inconsistent in actually applying them.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is regarding China. How do you envision our relationship, in particular with technology? Is there going to be any cooperation, or is it going to be an era of competition with China?
I think technology is one area where you're going to see not only competition with China, but some measure of the decoupling that is so talked about with respect to the broader U.S.-China economic relationship. I actually don't think you're going to see a tremendous amount of decoupling in a lot of areas of commerce with China. I mean, we still want to sell China soybeans, and we still want to, buy, I don't know, textiles. Because it's economically beneficial to both sides for those things to happen. Sophisticated technology is the area where I think the United States and some of its allies and partners are going to start drawing an increasingly high wall, or put a line around a finite number of technologies that it tries to deny to the Chinese, and that the Chinese will do the same thing on their side, and both sides will try to increase their indigenous capability to not be vulnerable to the other side. So, but how you do that is tricky, because what technologies, at what cost economically, and when do you end up incentivizing the other side to increase its indigenous capacity? These are all really tricky questions. So, do we want to incentivize the Chinese to develop a real competing operating system to iOS and Android? I don't think the answer is yes. But if we don't let iOS or Android run on Huawei phones that are owned by people in Europe, then we have done said thing. The Trump administration has sort of shut the door on semiconductor exports to about 60 Chinese companies, which means they've got, what's in the warehouse left to go. And that could really paralyze what they do unless they are able to find alternative sources of supply. And so, is that the right place to draw the line? Is it all semiconductors? Is it only, bespoke semiconductors? These are hard questions, but I think that's where a lot of the debate is going to be over the next, year or two.
And picking up on that, there was recent comments from the Chinese about rare earth minerals, which are used to build many of these components. Do you see them, the Chinese, actually stopping the shipment of rare earth minerals, or production, exporting them, or will the United States have to actually start producing them themselves, extracting them? It's an expensive and highly pollutant process, but do you think that's a possibility?
And there's already a bunch of, rare earths is a field that includes a number of different elements, and there are a number of programs already that the U.S. government has been engaged in to diversify the sources of supply. It's bad to have a reliance on China for a particular critical mineral, because it gives it an opportunity to use that as leverage in its foreign policy. But it's also bad to have, as has been the case in the past, a single source of supply somewhere in South America, and then there's a strike at the dock because the workers go on strike, and that interrupts the supply to the United States. So I think one of the lessons of the pandemic is how supply chains in general, whether it's for rare earths or anything else, need to have redundancy built into them, even though that's going to increase the costs associated with them. But the fragile supply chains with very little inventory just often puts a lot of things in jeopardy. That said, I think the Chinese will use their rare earth minerals in the same way that we've used semiconductors, which is to potentially at least restrict supply to countries or to companies that it thinks would act against its interests, or at least to hint that it would do so. And it's done so in the past. It did this with Japan, I don't know, it's probably a decade ago, where it basically cut off supply of some key rare earth minerals to Japan for a while because it was its nose was at a joint over the Japanese capture of a Chinese fisherman. But those two have ripple effects. I mean, the Japanese immediately sort of woke up and decided that they wanted to find alternative sources of supply, even if those are more expensive. And suddenly the Chinese monopoly on those didn't look as secure as it had before they started this whole thing. So they got a lot of calculations to make as well. But I do think that this is going to have a role to play in the broader kind of geopolitics.
Okay. And then one more question before I open it to the participants. What about other cyber players such as Russia, North Korea, and Iran? How are they trying to shape the future of technology in their favor, and what measures can be taken, to work against their progress?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a broad question because you have both areas where autocracies have harmonized their approaches, like in a few of the international standard setting bodies, all the way through, hacking and the SolarWinds hack and things like that. I think the thing that is common to Russia, Iran, and North Korea is that cyber attacks, of which there can be a huge variety, ranging from, as we saw in 2016, the attack and hacking of information that compromised our election there, or at least interfered with our election, all the way through. While everybody was focused on that in 2020, they're hacking the US government with SolarWinds, through the North Koreans using ransomware to try to earn money, or hacking Sony, or, and all of this. So it is, it's the weapon of choice for many of these countries, and its cost is relatively low and its benefits are relatively high. And, if you learn anything about deterrence theory, when the costs are low and the benefits are high, the adversary's answer is to repeat that activity until such time as that cost benefit benefit calculus changes. And the US has done some things to try to change that, yes, but it's easier said than done. So I think in that sense, it's a different, we worry about China in the hacking and things like that, but we worry about a lot more with China. With those countries, it's the kind of malicious activities they can carry out in cyberspace, and the effects that can have, especially for our own democracy, not just in cyberspace, but outside of it, that we really have to worry about.
Okay, thank you. And then here's one question from a participant. He or she says, the T12 sounds like a parallel for the Silk Road. I think they're thinking Belt and Road Initiative, focusing on the technology value chain, and asks how this work gives China's role and contribution in this sector.
I don't see it as analogous to the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese-funded infrastructure, essentially a foreign aid program that is funded by the government of China, that employs Chinese companies and often Chinese workers to build out infrastructure projects, down in Southeast Asia, across through the Middle East and into Europe, and then also across Central Asia. There's a digital Silk Road component to that as well, and that includes that sort of digital infrastructure, 5G infrastructure, Chinese sale of mass facial recognition software, the sort of panoply of stuff there as well. But that's really more of a foreign aid project in pursuit of geopolitical and economic gain for one country, which is China trying to, tie these markets closer to China so that it can have an economic benefit and then have a geopolitical benefit from the relationships that it's building, whether those ultimately are beneficial or coercive. Here, this is more, I think of it again more as kind of a G7, G8 grouping of countries that could harmonize their approaches across a variety of agenda items. So in that sense, I see it as pretty different.
Okay. And then another questioner asks, would there be any merit to including non-democracies in the alliance? That by excluding countries that aren't democracies, you might actually push them further toward China?
For this, I don't think there's merit in including non-democracies, but that doesn't mean that we won't work with non-democracies in lots of other ways. I mean, if you're going to have a group of techno democracies, to also have a group of techno non-democracies would lead to a certain incoherence of the agenda and the sort of common action. But that said, I mean, the competition with China goes well beyond, the democratic autocratic split. I mean, that's part of it. There's an ideological component, there's a values component, but the United States is working with Vietnam more closely every year than it did before, and other countries around the Indo-Pacific that could not fit squarely into a fully democratic paradigm. So I think both as a general matter and also specifically with technology cooperation, there's a lot that we can do with non-democratic countries that are worried about the Chinese dominance in this area. But for this particular effort, I think it should be limited to the democracies.
Okay, thank you. And then how do you think a prospective T12 would approach the potential to regulate digital currencies?
Yeah, that's a great, it's a great question. I don't really have a good answer to it. I mean, when you get into the regulation of currency, you're starting to get into an area that's complicated for obviously a couple of reasons. One, it's not a foreign policy matter alone or even primarily. So you have, and sometimes, it's a matter of an independent central banks, how it would regulate that currency. So that's one. You also have, if you're talking about the European countries, France and should be a member, but France doesn't use the franc anymore. It uses the euro, and that's an EU and European Central Bank thing. So that's one of the kind of issues that is one of these cross-cutting ones, which actually makes some of this tech coordination really difficult. And we've seen this in the past, way before there was a T12, where American officials have had the experience routinely where they would meet with the security officials of a country that would say, yeah, we love what the NSA is doing. We love coordinating with you guys. They're terrorists in our country. We want to share even more information. How can we help? And then they go from that meeting to a meeting with the privacy regulators, who sometimes worked for the national government, sometimes were EU based, and would say, you guys are totally out of the norm. It's a violation of our principles. You're going to see legal cases coming down. They're going to interrupt some of what's going on and things like that. And you would say, but do you know about what about those other guys? And it's, because these things are handled in two different areas in a way, they are in the US, but to a much less degree. There's a lot more integration of approach. So regulating digital currency is almost like that on steroids. So I don't have a great answer for exactly how you would go do that, but I think it's, at a minimum, I think discussing an assessment of what it means for China's digital renminbi to be existent, I think would be important, and how much we should care about this. Maybe we shouldn't care about it at all. I mean, the renminbi still is not fully convertible as a currency and things like that. Maybe this isn't a big deal, but maybe it is. And so that would be the starting point.
All right. And another participant asks that the T12, this concept is a great idea, but are we too late? many countries have already adopted China's technologies like Huawei and 5G. So it seems like the cat is out of the bag already.
Well, on Huawei 5G, the cat is like half out of the bag, and it seems to like sometimes go back in and sometimes go back out. So the British are the perfect example of this. So, originally the Australians came out and said, we will not allow Huawei to build out our 5G network. Join us, democracies of the world, in this principled effort, and all of this. And New Zealand did, and then the United States, even the Five Eyes, so-called Five Eyes of English-speaking who share all their intelligence, they expected the U.S. and the U.K. and Canada to fall in line immediately. Well, then you had Donald Trump saying, basically Huawei will not be allowed to build out the 5G network unless we make a trade at the negotiating table in the trade talks with China. Like they buy a lot of stuff, autos and soybeans, hey, who knows? Which sort of undermines the case that this is an affront to national security if you're willing to trade it away for soybeans. Okay, so we got through that. Then the US did come out and started demarching every government in the world saying, don't buy Huawei, even before the US had made a declaratory position that it wouldn't allow it to be done in the United States. The British came back and originally they said, well, yeah, we're privately, we're with you. Then they came out and said, no, we've done our own assessment, and it's bad for and for security if Huawei builds out the core of our 5G network, but the periphery, the kind of antennas and hardware and software around the periphery of the network, that's okay. They try to kind of split the difference, and so and the U.S. said no, that as a factual matter, that's not good security, and the British said no, you're wrong. As a factual matter, it is good security. Well, after Hong Kong and the Chinese sort of steaming into Hong Kong, the British decided, well, actually, it's not a good idea after all. So now they're back to, Huawei not building out the 5G. The Germans are, in this world where they'd like to establish a standard that doesn't say no China, doesn't say no Huawei, but sort of excludes them by definition. So countries are all over the place. I think the 5G experience is sort of, we're well into this. It's a case study, a textbook case of what we should never see happen again in terms of the way behind the ball. China comes out with sort of a all-in-one package of 5G hardware and software combined with, the sort of advocacy from the Chinese government and the reaction by countries that don't like that idea. And oh, by the way, it's a third, less costly than it is the alternatives. The alternative from the democracies say, we don't want you guys to do that. Well, okay, that's nice. But it's like anything else in this life. What are really the alternatives? How much do they cost? What's it going to cost me to say no to this one? And all this kind of stuff like that. It was very disorganized. I think the American approach got better over time, but the messaging wasn't great from the beginning. So that is the kind of thing. I mean, the Huawei thing is a great example that's kind of blown up, but this is just one example. We're going to face these sorts of dilemmas indefinitely on multiple issues into the future. And my hope is a group like this could get out ahead of it in a way that, in a siloed way that the countries didn't before.
All right, thank you. And there's a question about Estonia. And the question is whether they should be part of this Techno Nation group. And as we know with Estonia, they suffered quite a severe Russian cyber attack several years ago. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you could slice and dice who the 12 are and who's included and who's not in several different ways. Estonia, given both its experience and the expertise that it's developed in these areas over the past 2 decades, is, whether it's an official member, certainly has something to contribute in terms of how to think and deal with the issues of essentially persistent cyber threats. So what we did, in this article is sort of listed our 12, and then we said, okay, what would a sort of an expansion group look like? And so we said, okay, Italy, the Netherlands, Brazil, Chile, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Taiwan. I would love if we were in a discussion about, you know, who else gets to join, rather than whether to do this in the first place. And you could make a case for Estonia. We didn't sort of put in our little article, but certainly there's merit to the case.
All right. And another question, outside of politically based cyber hacks, why isn't there a larger discussion by companies such as IBM and countries regarding China stealing intellectual property and infringing upon tech-based patents? And is there a role for the private sector in the T12?
Yeah, and so that's a great two questions, really. The theft of intellectual property is really the potential for destructive hacking really is the thing that keeps so many of the private sector leaders up at night when it comes to the security of their technology. Because the theft of, I mean, some people have described the theft of intellectual property from to China over the past couple of decades, the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. Even if that's only half right, it's been vast. And a lot of companies have a very strong disincentive to disclose the loss of intellectual property via cyber means, because it would mean an immediate drop in their share price and immediate doubts about the security of the other intellectual property that they maintain and so forth. So, and then that's been made harder after the Edward Snowden disclosures, when a lot of companies, it became politically and sometimes even legally almost radioactive to deal with the NSA and share information with them, when that's, you know, one of the big government agencies that can help them understand what that is happening and how to deal with it. So those are, I mean, that is a huge issue, and I think it's one that is going to have to be attacked on multiple levels. There's certainly a defense aspect to this with each of the, you know, the companies and so forth. And we should remember, I mean, the U.S. government doesn't protect the cybersecurity of companies; they protect their own. Nor does the federal government protect the cybersecurity of state and local governments, which have been compromised by foreign nation actors and things like that, or hospitals, or whatever you want. So, and you know, we still haven't gotten, I don't think, to where we need to be in terms of the coordination of capabilities and how to do that. So that's a big area. And then I think there's a big role for the U.S. and other governments, because this kind of gets back to well, it really actually directly gets back to the cost benefit analysis, right? So the cost of you know, paying some hackers to see if they can infiltrate some companies and get their hands on some interesting blueprints or code or whatever is very low. The benefits can be very high to the defense industry in China, to the other commercial industries. So how do you increase the costs and reduce the benefits? Well, you reduce the benefits by increasing your defenses and making it so that each thing they grab is either harder to get or can't be gotten. But you got to increase the costs, and we have a huge surface area to protect by many different organizations in the United States. So unless you take offensive actions to increase the costs to your adversary, then I just don't think defense is going to do it. And you can, I mean, it's good to indict Chinese hackers or Russian hackers who've done things like this, but that has a limited effect. The T12 has to have a really key link with the private sector. And here, there's some models from other international organizations. The Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC, has a APEC CEO forum, APEC Business Leaders Forum, that meets together with the leaders every year, a forum for this kind of exchange between the private sector and the governments. And I think that's one potential model, because the private sector is going to have to have a metaphorical, if not literal, seat at the table of these things.
All right, thank you. And then we have a student who's earning a degree in global security, conflict, and cybercrime at NYU. And her question is, what's your impression of the role cyber diplomacy plays in the US response to authoritarian regimes' advancements? Is there anything you're doing with teaching capacity or otherwise to ensure that the next generation of diplomats is equipped with the knowledge and expertise to tackle difficult cyber policy issues?
Yeah, so there's on the cyber diplomacy side, there's the constructive stuff. How do you, like we're talking about, I mean, the T12 ultimately is a diplomatic initiative. How do you get together with like-minded countries and harmonize your approaches so that they're more effective than you are acting alone? And I guess the entire argument I'm making here is that cyber diplomacy has an important role to play. But also on the sort of the negative side of the ledger, which is communicating that there will be costs associated with authoritarian regimes' activities in certain ways. So, you know, Barack Obama tried this with Xi Jinping when he came to town in 2015, I believe it was. You know, the #1 agenda item was the theft of intellectual property via cyber means from China. And Obama basically said that we're going to continue to impose costs on you until such time as we see these things diminish. Part of this is hard to diagnose because you have to take on faith. Folks in the classified world who tell you what the magnitude of these were, but at least there's a case to be made that did decline in the aftermath of that. But then when American priorities shifted, it went right back up. So there is a role, I think, there, but of course that has to be backed by the willingness to take actions. I mean, just words alone are not going to do it. In terms of the next generation of foreign policy and national security officials and cyber policy, you know, I think their closing line in this little article is that technology is too important to be left to the technologists, which is a little flip, but kind of what we mean here is, you know, not every diplomat or foreign policy official has to be a software engineer. By no means, I would not be confused for a cybersecurity expert or a technical expert. But there has to be a basic level of fluency in technology issues if you're going to be active in this space. I mean, it's, I mean, technology shapes now every aspect of our own lives and our geopolitical lives as well. And it does so in a way that is more pervasive and more important than other functional issues that you might sort of get. And I mean, I think there's an analog here. I mean, if in 1970, when Henry Kissinger was national security advisor, he walked into the Situation Room and they were going to, or let's say it was 1973, and they talked about in the Yom Kippur War whether to raise the DEFCON level. If Kissinger has said, well, you know, I don't really know anything about nuclear weapons. I mean, my grandkids are on nuclear Facebook a lot, but, you know, let the engineers figure that out. People would have said, that's crazy. This is not a technical question, it has technical attributes, but ultimately this is a geopolitical national security question about what to do with these things we have. And so there has to be a baseline level of technical fluency that I think people indefinitely will have to go into these jobs with, which is why you see now, like, you know, the people who are talking about techno democracy, techno autocracy are people like Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who's not a software engineer. He's our top diplomat, but he's able to talk about these things. And I think that's what's going to be required. And so, you know, at my think tank, CNAS, we put, you know, an emphasis on the technological dimension of a lot of these sort of statecraft and geopolitical issues. Again, not to boil them down to a technological essential, but to realize that there's going to be a technological component to almost everything, whether you're talking about economics, defense, diplomacy, development, whatever it is. That's just the reality of the world we live in.
So how do you think you could get the techno democracies to unite in response to cyber attacks, for example? We've seen physically, we've seen in the physical realm what the Western response was to Russia's annexation of Crimea. This is something you mentioned in your article, that the sanctions were imposed, there was action. But when it comes to cyber, it's different. We've seen Russia, hack into our elections, into Germany, most likely, and the UK elections as well, but yet there was no common response, no really overt response. So how would such a coalition come up with a way to react to such threats or actions?
Yeah, so again, if you look at some of the existing models, I mean, the G7 has been a coordinating mechanism to take action in response to bad things that have happened, probably most famously throwing Russia out, or as they would say, convening without Russia after the Crimea invasion. I mean, that was essentially a diplomatic sanction that they got together to impose on a malign actor after it took a step that we thought was one to be opposed. Here, though, I think, the T12 is just one, on this specific question, is one of a number of different things that would have to be done. And actually, I think NATO's got a very important role here because, I mean, as you alluded to, there are certain things that happen, including outside of NATO countries, that NATO or just the transatlantic partners who happen to be in NATO respond to, sometimes quite vigorously. So, I mean, the annexation of Crimea elicited transatlantic sanctions that are still in place. That didn't happen in a NATO country, didn't happen inside the EU. There were more sanctions imposed after Russian support for Ukrainian or Russian partisans in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, and then actually crossing over the border with military equipment and people. Even when this Russian ex-spy Skripal was poisoned in the UK, Germany expelled diplomats, the United States expelled diplomats. That happened neither in Germany nor in the United States. It happened to a Russian national by the Russians. And then when Navalny, a Russian who's poisoned in Russia, they do that, and it galvanizes this international response. And for some reason, I think it gets to the way we think about cyberspace as something just different. Theoretically, all of our policy doctrines and internal stuff say, well, if the effect in cyberspace has an effect equivalent to that outside of cyberspace, it's the same thing, right? So if people get killed in a way through cyber means that we would consider it to be an act of war, just as if there was a bomb, it's the same thing, but we actually don't think of it that way. And I think when it comes to the protection of our democracy, our democratic practices and institutions, we really have to do that because, interference in the Brexit referendum, UK problem. Interference in the French election, French problem. Interference in the US election in 2016, American problem. No international response, no coordinated mechanism, no sanctions, no nothing. And yet, if you think about what's the more likely thing to happen, that Russia moves across the border into the Baltics with tank columns trying to seize NATO territory, or that it continues to try to meddle in our democracy through cyber means? I think the answer is obvious. And it's not that we shouldn't be prepared for tank columns rolling in. So we should also be prepared for the far likelier scenario where it's our democracy itself that is at risk.
All right, thank you. And then technological advancements traditionally have moved from the public sector to the private sector, but now we're seeing the reverse. Can you speak more about this and what impact it will have on U.S. capabilities?
Yeah, so for years, and this is particularly true of defense technology. So for years, there were technologies developed in the defense sphere, funded by the government, sometimes developed specifically by the government, that then migrated out into the commercial sphere and found commercial applications. So, the internet was ARPANET before it was the internet. GPS was developed for the military so people could figure out where they were. And now I don't know how to get out of my neighborhood without it. Things like that. And of course, now the reverse is the case. So there's so much technological innovation that's happening in the private sector. The Pentagon and other defense establishments around the world are trying to figure out how do they absorb that technology and configure it for their own uses in a way that is so different than the traditional way of acquiring products and with long cycle times and long contracting times and everything else. So this is something that I can say, the Department of Defense is really focused on, and they've done things, they now have a presence out in Silicon Valley. They have one in Austin, Texas. They have one in Boston in the robotics cluster up there. That is almost like that they've got their own budget, so make them a little bit different than just an embassy. But almost like a DoD embassy to those places to try to get a sense of what are the innovative potential applications, some of this technology, what are the pilot projects that can be done, things like that. But there's no bureaucracy like the defense bureaucracy, and so it's a very different thing to deal with huge defense prime contractors that are used to dealing with the Pentagon, or a startup in Silicon Valley that may have developed some amazing piece of technology, but is a relative handful of people that have never dealt with the government before. So it's a real challenge, and a lot of people are thinking about how to do this more effectively. And so they've made some interesting steps with some pilot programs and things, Project Maven and other things like that, to try to use AI applications and stuff to try to find IEDs and things. But there's a long way to go to getting that in better shape.
Okay. And there's a question here. How should the United States respond to the internet shutdown in Myanmar?
It's a good question, and I hesitate only because it's bound up in a broader question of which we do in general with Myanmar. And there's a debate in Washington going on about the relative merits of imposing costs, which is eminently possible if you want to sanction a country, as the Biden administration already has, for a coup that displaced the winners of the Democratic election there, but may have no positive benefit and may have a negative benefit, including pushing Burma more toward the Chinese as a geopolitical matter. In terms of the internet shutoff, there's sort of two answers on what do you do about an internet shutoff. There's the sort of micro technical answer. If we decided that we wanted to make the internet available, there are mesh networks and other things that the U.S. government and others have the capability to do to restore the internet in some areas, but would be pretty limited. The bigger question is, how do we rank Burma's geopolitical importance in this U.S.-China competition versus its importance on human rights? Personally, in that country, I would rank human rights great above, its sort of geopolitical swing state. But that doesn't answer the question of what can you do that's productive, other than continuing to try to delegitimize, as a diplomatic matter, the coup that happened there. And again, doing this in a multilateral fashion. The Quad foreign ministers met this morning. This is India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, and issued, some language basically condemning the rollback of democracy in Myanmar. So continuing those kinds of things, and then sort of targeted diplomacy around the people who've been in prison, like Aung San Suu Kyi and things like that. And then whatever support that we can find, potentially including technological support to the NLD people, some of whom now are in jail, and others who are out there. But anybody who's worked on Burma in the past 30 plus years know that it's never a straight line in that country, and we've been up and down and tried a lot of different things without a huge amount of success over the years.
Okay, and I think this will be the final question.
Let's not end on that depressing note. Let's you can always be optimistic, but maybe we can end on something that's a little bit cheerier.
Okay, well then let's end on a note of saying, how soon do you think we will see a T12 now that the Biden administration at least is entertaining this concept? How soon do you think we will see something start happening?
So when people ask questions about what is going to happen with a particular administration, and people like me answer, it's sometimes based on intelligence and sometimes based on inference. So this is based on inference, and you can apply the appropriate discount. So I'm just reading kind of the tea leaves. This is not that someone told me, yeah, on this day we'll do this. But I think we'll see something this year. I think the new team has come in, And it wants to obviously demonstrate a very clean break with the Trump administration in some key areas on relations with allies, on relations with international organizations and deals, the Iran deal, the WHO, the UN Human Rights Council, the Paris Climate Accord. And it wants to demonstrate that multilateral solutions are possible to some of the big challenges that we have, where those solutions haven't yet been in the offing. And I think this is kind of the big looming one. So I don't know, let's do this again next year. And if I'm wrong, then I will eat my humble pie, but that's my best guess.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard. We'll hold you to that then.
Yeah,
Okay. Thanks so much for a very interesting, fascinating discussion. And Courtney, back to you.
Thank you, Joanna, for moderating the discussion, and Richard, thank you so much. Really just a fantastic dig into what I think is a very forward-looking idea, and one that should be getting more attention, both should and probably will as well. So it's terrific to hear. Thank you all who participated. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the terrific questions. Our next briefing is also focused on the digital realm, and we're talking about digital development and using technology to advance global financial inclusion. So really looking at some of the lesser developed countries in the world. So we have Sabine Mensah, Ani Mukherjee, and Robin Lewis talking about that. It should be great. That's Monday, February 22nd, so next Monday at 12. So I hope you can all join, and you can RSVP through our website, through the QR code here. And also my constant plea, we are a nonprofit, as we see the light of the end of this pandemic, I would love to keep these virtual briefing series discussions going, and it does take individual support. So if you have it in your heart and your pockets to donate, please do. We would really appreciate it. So with that, Joanna, Richard, and everyone who joined, thank you so much. Really a fantastic discussion.
Thanks very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.